Goodbye, Ruby Tuesday. Who could hang a name on you? When you change with every new day, still I'm going to miss you. The world will not be the same without Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She passed away last night at the age of 87 due to complications of metastatic pancreatic cancer. And her death has sorrowed and saddened myself and many, many millions of other people, not only in the United States, but around the world. People who believed in change, in women and in their empowerment, who believed in feminism and the visions of an inclusive feminism for every woman, black, white, Latina, Native, Asian. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was more than a special Supreme Court justice. She was a special human being. She was the vanguard of change, an advocate, a pioneer, a leader, a woman who was indefatigable in her quest for justice, in her search for the uniqueness of a world that recognized that every woman had a place and every woman deserved not only respect, but empowerment, equality, and justice. On this episode of The Politicrat, for this day, Saturday, September the 19th, 2020, a look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
She never failed. She was fierce and unflinching in her pursuit of the civil and legal rights of civil rights of everyone. Her opinions and her dissent are going to continue to shape the basis for a law for a generation. And tonight and in the coming days, we should focus on the loss of the justice and her enduring legacy. But there is no doubt, let me be clear, that the voters should pick the president, and the president should pick the justice for the Senate to consider. This was the position of the Republican Senate took in 2016, when there were almost 10 months to go before the election. That's the position the United States Senate must take today, and the election is only 46 days off. I think the fastest justice ever confirmed was 47 days, and the average is closer to 70 days. And so we should do this with full consideration, and that is my hope and expectation what will happen. Thank you all. I'm sorry it was we had to learn it on the plane ride, but thank you very much.
That was Vice President Joe Biden last night, the former Vice President in Delaware, Wilmington, Delaware, making a brief statement about the passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. What a monumental loss this is for the country. Not just for the Supreme Court, for the country. This is somebody whose life embodied activism and justice, and whose life embodied leadership and courage and legal advocacy for women and for human rights. A feminist, somebody who took up the mantle of leadership, who argued in the Supreme Court before the court, who was a professor at Rutgers University, who was someone who led by example, who represented herself and other women with the kind of courage and dignity and humanity and stalwart persistence that you would always want. I was proud that I was alive during the time that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was alive. I am proud that I shared this world, shared part of this earth with one of the most legendary figures in American history, because that's who we've lost tonight. That's who we lost last night. We lost a giant. We lost a key pillar of American society last night. We lost a key pillar of the progressive movement last night. Even though Ruth Bader Ginsburg did not begin as a progressive, she certainly ended as one. Whether it was the dissents in the famous, or should I say infamous, cases of Bush v. Gore in the year 2000, or whether it was the infamous case of Shelby versus Holder in 2013, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, her dissents in those two cases were more famous than any majority opinion or concurrence that she joined. I think that those two dissents, Bush v. Gore and Shelby versus Holder, will go down in American jurisprudence as the most notorious of notorious RBG opinions. What happens to a flame extinguished? What happens to a life well lived? What happens to courage? What happens to bravery? What happens to a life well lived? In this hour, one of critical consequence, one where many may be despairing, one where many may be terrified, one where many feel the sadness and the pain of a loss that will be felt for years to come, not just in American jurisprudence, not just in the political sphere, but across the United States of America. So many young girls looked up to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, so many young boys as well. I was inspired by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I know she had that nickname, the notorious RBG. It was kind of cute to have that nickname. There was this endearing nature to the nickname. But there is no secret of the tenacity of Supreme Court Justice Ginsburg. There was no secret to her undying commitment to equal rights, to equal representation for women in all facets of life. I cannot underscore just how much she will be missed. I cannot underscore just how much her loss means. Last night, and even right now, today, on this Saturday, I am still heartbroken. It is a loss that will take some time to absorb, digest, and process. Even at this hour, I find myself struggling. Because although Justice Ginsburg was 87, and although she had a catalog of health issues over a 20-year period, I might add, the fact that this day has come still hits me like a Mack truck, blindsides. I was out and I walked back in, came back into the house, and on the television, there it was. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies at 87. And it was like a really bad nightmare, a bad dream. And I looked again, and that chyron did not disappear. The chyron didn't disappear, and nor did my sorrow, nor did my sadness last night, nor did my anger, quite frankly, because it seems as if the devil is gaining ground. This whole year, 2020, has been the year of the devil. It seems like the devil and evil have really combined to do the most malevolent damage. All throughout this year, we have lost people who really mattered to us, who really were good, decent people at their core. John Lewis, Chadwick Boseman, just last month, C.T. Vivian, Reverend Joseph Lowry, and now it really is unfathomable. And quite frankly, it's also terrifying. There are millions of people now, millions of people across the United States who are terrified following the passing of one of the giants of advocacy in this country. The Supreme Court now is at a very, very pivotal moment. And I'm going to get into the politics in a bit, but that is a bookmark to be noted. How do we come to grips with such a tremendous loss? How do we do this? Ruth Bader Ginsburg was somebody who never gave up on anything. She was sick for a long time. She was conducting Supreme Court oral arguments from hospital beds. She was doing that while she was sick. Her one wish on her deathbed was that she not be replaced. Until a new president was sworn in. Unfortunately, she's not going to get that wish, as last night, Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican, who controls the Senate, didn't wait for 3 days, as is customary in the Jewish faith, at least no more than 3 days before you bury somebody. Senator McConnell had no decency, but everybody knows that. And he did not let the tributes finish coming in yet, let alone allow for the burial of this great warrior. But for 1 hour after news of her passing spread, he tweeted out a message that he is going to consider a new Supreme Court justice and make sure that a vote would be conducted. Of course, that was a sharp contrast to 2016, when in the final year of Barack Obama's term in office, he found it fit to leave a Supreme Court seat open for 440 days. That was what Mitch McConnell did then, and now there's a Republican in the White House. His tune, of course, predictably has changed. Of course it's changed. You have to understand that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a transformative figure. I mean, you have people in the world and on the Supreme Court who made a real difference. You had a Thurgood Marshall. And you certainly had a Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think that as we reflect on her passing, we really have to take stock in what she meant to this country. She was a patriot. She did what Americans do. Stand up for what's right. Stand up for what's just. Stand up for the people who cannot stand up for themselves. And although she didn't begin her career like that, she sure ended it as the progressive firebrand. Her withering critiques, and I will be reading part of or all of the dissents of these two dissents that I just talked about earlier, but her critiques and her legal analysis will be remembered forever. This time is truly sad, and I barely have the energy to muster, even now, on Saturday the 19th of September, 2020, to really just comprehend how deep and sad a loss this truly is for the country. Yes, the notorious RBG is no longer with us, as this edition of The Politicrat takes time to remember the memory and honor the memory of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice here in the United States of America, who passed away last night at the age of 87 due to pancreatic cancer complications. By the way, pancreatic cancer is something that took the life of John Lewis just a couple of months ago now. Stage 4. Same thing with Aretha Franklin back in 2018. And, or was it 2019? One of those 2 years. And it was just devastating to learn that she had passed away. And even though we knew that the end was coming for her and for John Lewis and for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, this was really a hard time. And you've never heard me like this, because I am broken by this passing. And this is going to be a very difficult time. It's going to get better, but we are living through a year that is only going to get worse before it does get better. I think that is something that I need to be honest with any listener to my podcast here about. And I think it's very honest of myself to just postulate the truth of that. And the truth is that we cannot despair, even though these are despairing times. Ruth Bader Ginsburg did not despair. She kept fighting. That's what I remember about her. And she is going to be, as I said earlier, remembered more for her dissents than for her opinion making in terms of being in the majority. Because it's in her dissents where we find the true and honest voice of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I'm going to read as much as I can from the dissent that she gave in the infamous Bush v. Gore case in the year 2000. And I read it for two reasons. One, to give you an example for those who do not know or who are not aware of just how much of a firebrand and a plain-spoken truth teller Ruth Bader Ginsburg was as a Supreme Court justice, but also as a precursor to what we could be dealing with in December of this year with a possible showdown in the Supreme Court between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. That is what has everybody terrified, as well as whether Roe v. Wade will survive, whether Plessy versus Ferguson will survive, although that was separate but equal. I guess I should really be saying Brown v. Board of Education. Those are the kinds of things that keep me up at night, and probably keep you up at night as well. But here is the dissent of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, back in 2000 and, well, the year 2000. Oh, dearie me. I'm going to read some of this. As you know, Bush v. Gore was decided in favor of George W. Bush. The Supreme Court, for the first time in its history, stepped in and appointed the winner. Appointed a winner in the election. Overreach, as far as I'm concerned, trampling on the wishes of the electorate, and also on the state of Florida, telling the state of Florida, you cannot count any more votes. I mean, if that's not a trampling of any notion of democracy, then nothing is. But here again, I want to read out part of, or as much of this dissent as I feel that I can read. What a really, really tough time this is. For many people, even without knowing about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, this is a very difficult moment. But the storm is roughest just before the change, the calm, and the transformation. Here is part of the dissent by Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the case of Bush v. Gore in the year 2000. This is the dissent. The Chief Justice acknowledges that provisions of Florida's election code, quote, may well admit of more than one interpretation, end quote. But instead of respecting the state's high court's province to say what the state's election code means, the Chief Justice maintains that Florida's Supreme Court has veered so far from the ordinary practice of judicial review that what it did cannot properly be called judging. My colleagues have offered a reasonable construction of Florida's law. Their construction coincides with the view of one of Florida's 7 Supreme Court justices. I might join the Chief Justice were it my commission to interpret Florida law, but disagreement with the Florida court's interpretation of its own state's law does not warrant the conclusion that the justices of that court have legislated. There is no cause here to believe that the members of Florida's High Court have done less than, quote, their mortal best to discharge their oath of office, end quote. and no cause to upset their reasoned interpretation of Florida law. The court more than occasionally affirms statutory and even constitutional interpretations with which it disagrees. For example, when reviewing challenges to administrative agencies' interpretations of laws they implement, we defer to the agencies unless their interpretation violates, quote, the unambiguously expressed intent of Congress, end quote. We do so in the face of the declaration in Article 1 of the United States Constitution that, quote, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, end quote. Surely the Constitution does not call upon us to pay more respect to a federal administrative agency's construction of federal law than to a state high court's interpretation of its own state's law. And not uncommonly, we let stand state court interpretations of federal law with which we might disagree. Notably, in the habeas context, the court adheres to the view that, quote, there is no intrinsic reason why the fact that a man is a federal judge should make him more competent or conscientious or learned with respect to federal law than his neighbor in the state courthouse, end quote. No doubt there are cases in which the proper application of federal law may hinge on interpretations of state law. Unavoidably, this court must sometimes examine state law in order to protect federal rights. But we have dealt with such cases, ever mindful of the full measure of respect we owe to interpretations of state law by a state's highest court. Refusing to supplant Illinois law with a federal definition of waiver, we explained that the state court's declaration, quote, should bind us unless so unfair or unreasonable in its application to those asserting a federal right as to obstruct it, end quote. In deferring to state courts on matters of state law, we appropriately recognize that this court acts as a, quote, outsider lacking the common exposure to local law which comes from sitting in the jurisdiction, end quote. That recognition has sometimes prompted us to resolve doubts about the meaning of state law by certifying issues to a state's highest court, even when federal rights are at stake. The Chief Justice's casual citation of these cases might lead one to believe that they are part of a larger collection of cases in which we said that the Constitution impelled us to train a skeptical eye on a state court's portrayal of state law, but one would be hard-pressed, I think, to find additional cases that fit the mold. As Justice Breyer convincingly explains, this case involves nothing close to the kind of recalcitrance by a state high court that warrants extraordinary action by this court. The Florida Supreme Court concluded that counting every legal vote was the overriding concern of the Florida legislature when it enacted the state's election code. The court surely should not be bracketed with state high courts of the Jim Crow South. And I mean, this dissent goes on, and I probably haven't even got really to the meat of the dissent, but I will read this part of it here. I agree with Justice Stevens that the petitioners have not presented a substantial equal protection claim. Ideally, perfection would be the appropriate standard for judging the recount, but we live in an imperfect world, one in which thousands of votes have not been counted. I cannot agree that the recount adopted by the Florida court, flawed as it may be, would yield a result any less fair or precise than the certification that preceded that recount. Even if there were an equal protection violation, I would agree with Justice Stevens, Justice Souter, and Justice Breyer that the court's concern about the December 12th date is misplaced. Time is short, in part because of the court's entry of a stay on December 9th, several hours after an able circuit judge in Leon County had begun to superintend the recount process. More fundamentally, the court's reluctance to let the recount go forward, despite its suggestion that, quote, the search for intent can be confined by specific rules designed to ensure uniform treatment, end quote, ultimately turns on its own judgment about the practical realities of implementing a recount, not the judgment of those much closer to the process. Equally important, as Justice Breyer explains, the December 12th date for bringing Florida's electoral votes into safe harbor lacks the significance the court assigns it. Were that date to pass, Florida would still be entitled to deliver electoral votes. Congress must count, unless both houses find that the votes, quote, had not been regularly given, end quote. The statute identifies other significant dates. But none of these dates has ultimate significance in light of Congress's detailed provisions for determining on, quote, the 6th day of January, end quote, the validity of electoral votes. The court assumes that time will not permit, quote, orderly judicial review of any disputed matters that might arise, end quote. But no one has doubted the good faith and diligence with which Florida election officials, attorneys for all sides of this controversy, and the courts of law have performed their duties. Notably, the Florida Supreme Court has produced two substantial opinions within 29 hours of oral argument. In sum, the court's conclusion that a constitutionally adequate recount is impractical is a prophecy the court's own judgment will not allow to be tested. Such an untested prophecy should not decide the presidency of the United States. I dissent. That was part of the legendary dissent of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, in December of 2000 in the case of Bush v. Gore. When I return, reading another dissent from Ruth Bader Ginsburg from the case of Shelby versus Holder, and remembering more of the life of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the United States Supreme Court Justice. I think it's somewhat fitting that the most legendary dissents of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had both to do with voting and the voting process and the counting process. I find that to be really interesting. Both dealt with voting. Bush v. Gore dealt with the counting of the votes and the ability of the Florida legislature and the Florida state court to dictate that and allow that to continue unencumbered. While Shelby v. Holder, 13 years later, dealt with accessing voting and being able to vote and not have that process encumbered and not have states be able to make these changes without any kind of oversight or notice. And I must say that Shelby v. Holder was a case that eviscerated the Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. And just like in Bush v. Gore, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg made it clear that she was not having it. I'm going to read you a portion of the dissent in the Shelby case. Following the 2000 census, the city of Albany, Georgia, proposed a redistricting plan that DOJ, that's the Department of Justice, found to be, quote, designed with the purpose to limit and retrogress the increased black voting strength in the city as a whole, end quote. In 2001, the mayor and all 5 white member board of aldermen in Kilmichael, Mississippi, abruptly canceled the town's election after, quote, an unprecedented number, end quote, of African-American candidates announced they were running for office. DOJ required an election, and the town elected its first black mayor and 3 black aldermen. In 2006, this court found that Texas's attempt to redraw a congressional district to reduce the strength of Latino voters bore, quote, the mark of intentional discrimination that could give rise to an equal protection violation, end quote, and ordered the district redrawn in compliance with the VRA. In response, Texas sought to undermine this court's order by curtailing early voting in the district, but was blocked by an action to enforce the Section 5 pre-clearance requirement. In 2003, after African Americans won a majority of the seats on the school board for the first time in history, Charleston County, South Carolina, proposed an at-large voting mechanism for the board. The proposal, made without consulting any of the African American members of the school board, was found to be an, quote, exact replica, end quote, of an earlier voting scheme that a federal court had determined violated the VRA. That's the Voting Rights Act. The county then sought to move a polling place. In 1993, the city of Millen, Georgia, proposed to delay the election in a majority black district by 2 years, leaving that district without representation on the city council, while the neighboring majority white district would have 3 representatives. The county then sought to move a polling place from a predominantly black neighborhood in the city to an inaccessible location in a predominantly white neighborhood outside city limits. In 2004, Waller County, Texas, threatened to prosecute 2 black students after they announced their intention to run for office. The county then attempted to reduce the availability of early voting in that election at polling places near a historically black university. In 1990, Dallas County, Alabama, whose county seat is the city of Selma, sought to purge its voter rolls of many black voters. DOJ rejected the purge as discriminatory, noting that it would have disqualified many citizens from voting, quote, simply because they failed to pick up or return a voter update form when there was no valid requirement that they do so, end quote. These examples, and scores more like them, fill the pages of the legislative record. The evidence was indeed sufficient to support Congress's conclusion that, quote, racial discrimination in voting in covered jurisdictions remained serious and pervasive, end quote. Now, she continues on in this dissent, and it's pretty damn compelling. And it goes on and on and on, and it's passionate and powerful, and you really must read it. I'll put a link to it on this episode. There were a lot of really good things, and I didn't even get to the heart of them. But that was Justice Ginsburg trying in her own inimitable way. And not just trying, but advocating for those who couldn't advocate for themselves. It's a tremendous dissent. It's long, but it's well worth reading. It's a very important dissent. as the case is, it spelled the end of the Voting Rights Act, essentially. I mean, it's intact, except for Section 4, which was gutted. So I do recommend you read that dissent. When I return, more on the passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Forget the bull in the china shop, there's a china doll in the bullpen. Walk with the switch, fire in the fist, biting at the bit, swinging every pitch, coach put me in like, forget the bull in the china shop.
Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away last night at the age of 87. And yeah, maybe she was a china doll in the bullpen, as Dessa was just singing there. But perhaps I think it's a little bit more than that. China doll, American doll, I don't know if I want to use the word doll. I just think that Supreme Court Justice Ginsburg was such a towering figure. For someone who was, barely 5 feet tall, she stood taller than the Empire State Building. Quite frankly, she stood taller than the Washington Monument. I mean, she meant so much to so many people. So many people were inspired by her. I think so many women were, obviously, but I do think that so many people in general were inspired by her courage and her tenacity and her wisdom and her leadership. Pretty close to the end of her life, she was inspiring high school students and college students and lecturing them and visiting their campuses and their schools and giving the youth and young women in particular advice for the future and how they should pursue their careers. The documentary RBG, which came out a couple of years ago now, I seem to remember, will certainly get played over this weekend, but can be found, I believe, on Netflix or any other streaming platform. And that documentary talked about her inspiration of the youth and how she inspired them in her trips to their schools. And there's a lovely moment in that movie where she does connect with young women in particular, but with the younger generation. And one of the things I hope happens is that the younger generation do pay their respects to her, because although many of them were too young to note the gravity of what RBG has meant to the Supreme Court and to the country, they certainly can understand that she inspired them too in everything they wanted to do that was contributing to something good in the world. And it is not lost upon me. No, it is not lost upon me that with the passing of Justice Ginsburg, still with us are people like Bill Barr and Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump. People like this are still with us. And people like RBG are not.
I surely would not be in this room today without the determined efforts of men and women who kept dreams alive, dreams of equal citizenship.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the Supreme Court's feminist icon. Small, soft-spoken, yet fiercely determined, she was an unstoppable force who transformed the law and defied social conventions.
To her fans, she's known as Notorious RBG. Supreme Court's a boys club, she holds it down, no cares given. Who else got 6 movies about them and still living?
Ginsburg was hailed as a crusader for women's rights. But her legal legacy was even more sweeping.
The project she brought to the Supreme Court, first as a leading women's rights lawyer of her day, and then as a justice for all those years, I actually think has been kind of misunderstood. She had a really radical project to erase the functional difference between men and women in society. She wanted to make it clear that there should be no such thing as women's work and men's work.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court.
In fact, in many of the landmark cases Ginsburg argued before the Supreme Court as a young lawyer for the ACLU, her clients were often men. One key case involved a man from New Jersey whose wife died during childbirth.
Stephen Weisenfeld's case concerns the entitlement...
He wanted to work less and stay home with his son, but found out only widows, not widowers, were eligible for Social Security payments.
Ruth Ginsburg went to court on his behalf and said that law, that distinction between mothers and fathers, incorporates a stereotyped assumption of what women do and what men do in the family and is unconstitutional.
Laws of this quality help to keep women not on a pedestal, but in a cage.
She won. And that was the kind of case that she brought, and it was really very significant in the march toward the court establishing a jurisprudence of sex equality.
What inspired Ginsburg to take on such a bold project? There was little sign of anything radical in the beginning.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg grew up in Brooklyn in a lower middle class family. When she was in high school, she was a twirler, a cheerleader with a baton. She was known as Kiki Bader, and she played a very traditional female role in her high school.
Ginsburg's mother, who'd been a star student until she was forced to drop out of school to put her brother through college, had big ambitions for her daughter. But the day before Ruth's high school graduation, her mother died of cancer. It was that shattering loss, Ginsburg said many years later, that instilled in her the determination to live a life her mother could have only dreamed about.
I pray that I may be all that she would have been had she lived in an age when women could aspire and achieve, and daughters are cherished as much as sons.
That was part of a tribute that the New York Times has done for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It's an excellent tribute. It goes on for it's a total of around 11 and a half minutes. And I really would probably not want to play you all of that here. I think it does better justice to all of you to actually watch that on the New York Times website at nytimes.com. It's a remarkable bit of documentary footage, 11 and a half minutes of which you really have to watch. I just played you just over 3 minutes of that 11 and a half minutes, and I urge you to watch the rest at the NewYorkTimes.com website on the front page, on the homepage. So that's just a glimpse of her life, of the late great U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. What a towering loss. And, the politics are obvious, as I alluded to earlier. And it's difficult not to talk about the politics, but it's also unseemly to talk about the politics. And I think I'll hold off in abeyance on the politics about McConnell. We know what McConnell's going to do. He released a statement last night announcing that he was going to be the biggest hypocrite. And the Democrats crying about, we need integrity checks, as Senator Cory Booker said earlier last night, and all of that kind of nonsense. There is no integrity check when it comes to power, Senator Booker. It just doesn't exist. You cannot have integrity checks in politics because there are not integrity people in politics. Rare is the integrity person that exists in politics. Very rare indeed. And all of them are no longer with us, quite frankly, with maybe one or two exceptions. Maybe 3 exceptions. Next, what we must do in RBG's name. Voters must participate, And not only must they participate in early voting or on the night of the election or the day of the election, whichever one they choose, whether it's early voting or the day of, what they should also be doing is holding their representatives' feet to the fire. No matter what. No matter what your condition, no matter what, everybody can do something. Rosa Parks did something. Dr. King did something. Tammy Duckworth, who's now a senator, did something. Ilhan Omar did something. AOC did something. They ran for office. They ran for office. Everyone can do something. If you're not going to run for office, then you can do something else. You can put pressure on these politicians. And we have seen it throughout history, as recently as this year and last, that when you call politicians by phone and you hold their feet to the fire, they get enough pressure on them, they change their position. We've seen it a million times. There is absolutely no excuse for any of us, I don't care who we are, to not activate ourselves and do something to put pressure on these people. These politicians represent you and I. And they are put in there by us. So we must put pressure on them and demand that they work in our interests. Instead of voting and then going away for 2 years. Instead of voting and going away for 4 years. And in those intervening 4 years, not do a darn thing to challenge what was going on that you didn't like. To hold those politicians accountable. To keep them honest. That is the thing that voters must also do. It is not only about a vote. I have said this many times here. And in the tradition of Justice Ginsburg, you fight on. Everyone can do something. If you're not going to run for Congress, then do something else. If you can't do that something else, then get someone to advocate for you. But everybody can do something. And I am sure that now, the now late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a pioneer among pioneers, would appreciate the urgency of this moment. As terrifying as it is, things can get rough and get real rough just before the change happens. And we are the change. So vote, keep moving forward, and stay active in your own name and in the name of U.S. Supreme Court Justice, the now late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. May she rest in power. Thank you for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.
I pray that I may be all that she would have been had she lived in an age when women could aspire and achieve, and daughters are cherished as much as sons.